The first part of today, I thought I'd just go through a little bit of what's been the philosophy behind these approaches to how we engage and talk about religion, and some of that shifting field, because I think that sometimes gives us new insight into where we might be able to go with that. If we started to look initially about understandings of how people engaged with religion, we begin historically from a theological stance. So faith-seeking understanding. So when we're talking faith-seeking understanding, we are presuming that everybody is a believer within the tradition. They belong to the faith tradition and they want to know more about it. And over time, particularly when we got to the Enlightenment, there were some questions about how could you, in inverted commas, objectively study religion if you were the insider to the tradition. It was questioned particularly around the Enlightenment. How could we objectively study things? So a religious worldview, if you like, was divorced from how people understood the world, and it became very much an emphasis on a scientific worldview because we could prove things, right? And we couldn't prove things, so-called prove things, in a theological view. So a method of study was developed called the history of religions. And in the history of religions, people started to study religious traditions other than the one they belonged to, or a variety of religious traditions, and they may have belonged to none. And sometimes that may have got to a one-sided interpretation. If you belong to a religious tradition, it could have been that you were looking at that religious tradition through your own glasses only, and imposing, as the scholars said, your particular interpretation on that religious tradition. One example might have been something like sacraments. So if you came from a Catholic worldview and had a sacramental view of life, and then started to investigate Hinduism, sometimes the terminology related to sacraments and ritual in the Catholic tradition became overimposed on Hinduism. So some people would have said it's a sacramental experience for Hindus to bathe in the Ganges. Well, in fact, it may not be, because they may not have a sacramental view of life. Do you see how the language of one religious tradition, became imposed on the other? So that was sometimes where it's a one-sided affair, and sometimes a description of a religion could have been superficial, that we were looking at the actions of what was happening in a ritual without knowing what the motivation of the insider that brought them to perform those actions. So another couple of hundred years passed, right, and people started to question validly how this approach to religion might have worked. From the history of religion developed what was called comparative religion studies. And comparative religion studies, comparative is an awkward word to deal with, because in comparisons we often use oppositional terminology. So when someone says to me, "What is your sister like?" I say, "She's younger than me, she's thinner than me, she's got blonde hair." Right? They're oppositional, right? And we try to define ourselves through difference. And often that difference is set up in an oppositional terminology. And that's really what happened with Judaism and Christianity. It was a very oppositional identity that had been set up prior to the Second Vatican Council. So comparative is a difficult word to deal with, because we sometimes move into oppositional terminology. The scientific description that comes out of the umbrella field of comparative religion eventually comes out of the family of approaches called phenomenology. So phenomenology says that you can bracket yourself, right? Any biases that you have, you can bracket them out, and you can look at a religious element objectively. And this really, the phenomenological approaches really went through from the mid-1850s still exist today, but are really on the borderline now of how people understand religion. And were particularly criticised from the 1960s and 70s onwards because people believed that you couldn't suspend your judgment. You are who you are when you come to read or study anything. And the best thing you can do is to acknowledge your bias or your preconceptions and then try to deal with it, rather than to suspend it completely. So where have we come from in the studies of religion development in Australia and Queensland? So when the syllabus in studies of religion was first released in 1985, we had a particularly strong phenomenological approach to the study of religion. And that was basically because some of the people who were the founders of the syllabus had studied with Ninian Smart in the UK. We also know that Smart developed those dimensions not for the study of religion in schools, but for an academic study of religion in a tertiary setting. So they were never meant to be used at school. And they were also meant to be not just bland categories where you could fit stuff in a box under a heading. So if you think of Smart's dimensions, you know, it originally started with 6 and then went to 7, so the material one was added. If from a Christian tradition we wanted to look at Eucharist, where would you fit Eucharist in Smart's 7 dimensions? Predominantly, where would you fit one? Ritual. People would say you could, at this level, say yes, it just fits under ritual. But as an insider to a tradition, you know, as you just said, it fits under a number of categories. So it's related to sacred text. It's related to how people interact with each other. So it's more than just being one category. And what happened at a surface level with Smart's dimensions was people boxed things off and tended not to see the interrelationship to them. And when the syllabus developed further, and we started to look at areas of investigation, for example, religion-state relationships, or the search for meaning, as it used to be called, you couldn't really apply Smart's dimensions to those categories. So it wasn't an overall encompassing way of engaging and learning about religion. Moore and Harville, 2 Australian educators, in 1982, when they put their book out, When Religion Goes to School, used Smart's dimensions as a basis and expanded them to a typology. How might these types be investigated? And they added and subtracted, but basically they still came out of the phenomenological school of how you might study religion. Terry Lovett fits into that mode as well. In the UK, in the 1990s, a fellow called Robert Jackson, who had been involved in the teaching of world religions across the UK for a number of years, developed what was called the interpretive approach. And Jackson really wants to look at how do you investigate religion from insider and outsider perspectives. So if we're studying Buddhism, we're obviously the outsider, but there may well be Buddhists in your school classrooms who are the insiders in that tradition, and how do you move to a dialogical model of education that can have the conversation within those traditions happening? The interpretive approach is based around a dialogical model. So in 2001, in the review of the study of religion syllabus, there was a significant shift away from phenomenology only that said you need to use multiple approaches to this, and how might that work? And then by the time we get to 2008, we are firmly grounded in an inquiry approach. Now that has been driven by 2 things. Pedagogically, it was driven by inquiry learning and how students would engage in the learning process. And it was also driven by changes that happened at QSA. So prior to the 2008 syllabus, the Studies of Religion syllabus had a separate subject area committee, right, which worked on religion only, right, and it was their brief. Sometime between 2001 and 2008, there was an amalgamation of those syllabus committees, and the religion syllabus landed in the social science groupings. The social science grouping had a general inquiry approach to learning, and when the review of the study of religion syllabus started, that committee said, this religion syllabus doesn't look like the other syllabuses in this grouping. It has some elements of it, but it doesn't look like the rest. And so the syllabus committee was charged with, how does this fit within this grouping? And inquiry learning had grown a lot in schools, so the inquiry model became one of the models in the way the syllabus committee thought we could investigate religion. Now, one of the struggles in developing the inquiry model that you have now in the syllabus was that traditionally inquiry learning was also bracketed with problem solving. And the committee didn't want religion to be a problem. See, often in science, you set up the problem and you investigate it. So if you were looking at religion, to set religion up as a problem was a difficulty. And so the inquiry model that has been developed in the syllabus for study of religion was an amalgamation and a tweaking of a variety of inquiry models to get one that suited the discipline. And that's how it came together. So basically the inquiry model is also looking at critical religious literacy, where critical not in the sense of criticising, but in critiquing, asking significant questions about what is this information we have before us, who has presented it to us, might there be a bias in that, and how might I go about finding more information that fits to that, which also fits with the inquiry model that is not a left to right process. You don't start here and land there step by step. The inquiry model is in a circle, and you're going to go back and forth within that model as you move forward. And even by the time you get to the end of reflecting about my learning process, may take you right back to the framing at the same time. Right? So it's a back and forth model within that. So, where are we now? So 2008, it's a long time ago. So there has been some shifts. Now in the institutional study of religion, there has historically been a separation, a fairly strong separation, from the people who study theology and the people who study religion. We can see this in the history of the development of the Religion Studies Department at UQ. So in the 60s up until the mid-70s, the Religion Department at the University of Queensland had a Bachelor of Divinity. So very strongly rooted in the study of theology. As religion studies, and then there was that whole question about, is this a valid form of study for a public university? And then eventually by the late 70s, UQ moves to a studies of religion department. Right, so it shifts from the model of theology into the history of religion, the comparative religion vein into a phenomenological vein. Very clear distinctions within the academy about that.